Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, hopefully many of you have by now seen the sit-down conversation that I was able to have with Susan Eisenhower, who is the granddaughter of Dwight David Eisenhower, our President of the United States, and also one of our leading generals from the Second World War. So I thought it'd be a really good time to take a deeper dive into Eisenhower's story. I know some about his story, and I'm learning more all the time, and I'm currently reading Susan's book about how he led, and I've been really impressed so far by just his style of leadership and the way he was able to deal with really huge personalities and do it all without belittling people and without having to resort to some of the things that people sometimes resort to when they get into power. So we're going to take a look at Biographics. As always, the link is in the description to the original content if you want to be able to see it without my commentary. And at the end, I will throw the link to my sit-down interview with Susan Eisenhower, so you can check that out if you haven't already seen it. Let's dive in.
When scholars rank US presidents, there are four 20th century names that always break the top 10. FDR, Truman, Teddy Roosevelt, and Dwight D. Eisenhower. One of the most popular men of his era, Eisenhower had the fortune to lead America through a prolonged economic boom. During his tenure, the middle class drastically expanded, poverty was reduced, and peace and stability reigned. This was the era of TV's first golden age of consumer choice of exciting new technology. When films and shows like Happy Days and Back to the Future wanted to portray American innocence, it would be to Eisenhower's era that they returned again and again.
Yeah, that's true. And, you know, we have to recognize, too, and I'm not trying to take anything away from Eisenhower's leadership. I think he was one of our best presidents. In fact, I typically rank him right around fifth when I'm ranking presidents. But it's also important for us to note that sometimes people come along at times in history that are naturally predisposed to either be good or bad. Some of the presidents leading up to the American Civil War, anything other than an extraordinary leader would probably have been remembered as a failure during those times just because of everything that was going on. And this time in history, post-World War II, as we're getting into the Cold War and starting to deal with civil rights, it was a challenging era, but there were a lot of things that the United States had going for it after the war, after the economic boom that happens because of the war. So I think most presidents would have probably done okay in that time, but Eisenhower obviously is remembered as being an exceptional leader.
Yet who really was the man at the center of it all? Who was the president who steered the nation through one of its most iconic decades? Born in modest circumstances in North Texas, Eisenhower grew up fascinated with the military. Joining the army as a young man, he rose through the ranks, eventually becoming Supreme Commander of Allied forces during D-Day. Swept to the presidency on the back of his wartime popularity, he promised an era of optimism. His successes and failures would define an entire generation.
Good-looking guy.
You know how some kids know from the age of 4 exactly what they want to do with their lives? Well, that was Dwight D. Eisenhower all over. From almost the moment he could read, the future president wanted to be in the military.
Yeah, and that sets him apart from some other folks who didn't necessarily set out. You know, Ulysses S. Grant, for example, had no interest whatsoever in being a military guy. Even after he went to West Point, he didn't want to be in the military. He wanted to be a professor. But some people just have that drive. And, we don't necessarily think of Ike as this really driven kind of want to be in charge guy, but he really was that guy. The way he comes across, he doesn't seem arrogant about it like a MacArthur, for example. But Ike had every bit that desire. And he was actually born David Dwight Eisenhower. And it flipped at some point.
Born on October the 14th, 1890, in a ramshackle house in Denison, North Texas, there had been nothing in Eisenhower's background that indicated army material. His father was a blue-collar worker, while his mother was a pacifist Mennonite who considered war almost as immoral as laziness. For young Ike, as Eisenhower was known, that meant a boyhood of prayer and hard work. It also meant inheriting a hilariously Victorian attitude to society.
And the Eisenhowers are originally from the area of South and Southeast Pennsylvania. A lot of roots there that he had. His family just a couple generations earlier had moved west. Of course, we identify him with Kansas, but like a lot of presidents, he was born in one state but grew up in another or became associated with another.
Even when he was president, Ike would blush crimson if he ever accidentally used a cuss word in front of a woman. Yet behind this strict religious upbringing, behind this facade of a blue-collar, football-loving boy, lurked an ambition that would shape the nation. Whenever he had a moment to spare, Eisenhower devoured books about military history. Although he kept it quiet from his mum, it's not too hard to imagine he already had his heart set on an army career. The first step in realizing this dream came in 1911. By now living with his folks in Kansas, Ike had grown into an athletic, competitive man whose stern discipline masked a volcanic temper. He was also a supremely hard worker. After graduating high school, Ike made a pact with his brother Edgar to work for 2 years to pay Edgar's tuition fees, after which Edgar would go out to work to support Eisenhower's studies. True to his word, Ike had taken 2 jobs to keep Edgar in education, barely giving himself enough time to sleep.
Think about the kind of person that is. You're driven, you're ambitious, you have your own plans, but no, I'm going to take 2 years out of my life and I'm going to work hard to help my brother get ahead. It tells you a lot about the guy, that while he was driven, while he was ambitious, while he had goals and things he wanted to accomplish, he also was willing to lay those aside to help other people get ahead.
But before Edgar could fulfill his side of the bargain, good news came Eisenhower's way. West Point Military Academy was going to accept him free of charge. For most of the family, this is the first they learned of the young man's military ambitions. It's said that his pacifist mom burst into tears, but there was no talking the boy out of it. He enrolled at the academy and promptly settled into being utterly average.
Utterly average. But you know what? Some of the utterly average classes, our folks in these classes at West Point end up going to great things. That's, one of the weird things about education sometimes, right? Some people can be so terrible at certain subjects, but they're really, really good at what matters for their future career. And in the end, that's really all that matters.
Yep, that burning ambition of Eisenhower's hadn't extended to being a great officer or a great general. He was content to coast by, to do the bare minimum required to fulfill his dream of seeing action. We can see this from his ranking at graduation. 61st out of 164. Solid, but certainly not spectacular. Still, this was nearly enough. In spring of 1917, the USA declared war on Germany. By now married to Mamie Geneva Dowd, who had met while stationed in San Antonio, Ike had every reason to hope America's entry into World War I would prove to be his shot at glory. Even though he was forced to spend the year in charge of a tank training center in Pennsylvania, the army was soon shipping people out by the thousands.
So if you are a young officer right out of West Point and suddenly there is a major world war that happens, this is your chance to get ahead, right? Because think about it, in the peacetime army, the advancement opportunities really aren't there. And guys like George Patton find this out, right? He's a colonel in World War I, but then he gets reverted back to his peacetime rank, and it takes him another 2 decades to get back up to being a colonel again in the peacetime army. And so seeing action, leading troops in combat, that's your ticket to any chance of advancement, especially if you're 60th in a class of 160 some at West Point. But that's not Ike's path to leadership. He never leads troops in combat, ever in his life. But people in his life, especially superiors over him, are going to recognize his qualities as a staff officer. And that's where he's going to get ahead.
In late 1918, Ike finally got the call. Well, before he could set out for Europe, history intervened. In November 1918, World War I ended. Eisenhower must have been the only person on Earth upset to see the carnage over.
So he was in charge of a tank training school at Camp Colt, which is in Gettysburg. And so that's his first connection to Gettysburg, which is going to kind of become his home after World War II. But for most of the time he's there, for a good bit of the time he's there, they don't have tanks. And so he's thinking, okay, well, what is a tank but a moving gun platform? And so he actually uses trucks to train guys on how to fire from a moving vehicle. And so he gets innovative and he thinks of whatever he can do. But thinking about the fact that tanks are going to play such an important role in World War II, guys like Eisenhower, guys like Patton, who have experience with tanks, are going to become vital in that war.
Grouching that he'd missed his big opportunity, he instead turned to working with an army buddy named Cameo Alert George S. Patton on a series of articles advising the military to invest in tanks for future conflicts. But rather than being like, cool, consider us advised. The army brass were more like, no podcast president is going to tell us what to do. Indeed, they threatened him with a court-martial. Shunted off to the Panama Canal Zone, told to keep his opinions to himself, Eisenhower could have faded into obscurity then and there, had it not been for one man. Down in Panama, Ike's commanding officer was General Fox Connor, a guy who valued creative thinking. When he heard the younger man's ideas for the future of warfare, Connor didn't threaten him with punishment. Instead, he pulled some strings and got him into the prestigious Command and General Staff College. This was where the future of the military was made.
If you get sent to this place, it's the fast track. This is the place that people look to when they want staff officers, when they want high-ranking leadership. And if you look back through history over the last 100 years or so, most of the guys who rise up to high military rank go through here. So just like is the case with most people, very few people rise to the top on their own. They have to have help along the way. They have people who recognize their abilities, who recognize their talent, and give them the push, give them the bump, give them the position that they need to be able to get ahead.
A place for the creme de la creme of the officer corps. Connor was taking a huge gamble sending an average soldier like Eisenhower there. But it was a gamble that would pay off for the entire world.
Yep.
Now, before we go any further with Dwight's story, let's have a quick... Now let's get ready for war. Once Eisenhower got into Command and General Staff College, he never looked back. When he graduated in 1926, he was first in his class of 245. From there, it was the Army War College, then traveling with big shot generals to get experience. But the biggest, shottiest general of them all was still to come. In 1933, Eisenhower became an aide for Army Chief of Staff General Douglas MacArthur. Yeah, that Douglas MacArthur. Fan of corncob pipes, aviator sunglasses, and generally being an all-round hard ass.
So it's important to note that even once we get into World War II, because I see a lot of people commenting, for example, on my video, my short where I talked about Ulysses S. Grant getting the opportunity to be promoted to General of the Armies of the United States, which is kind of an equivalent of a 6-star rank. And people say, well, what about Eisenhower? Well, remember, Eisenhower was not even the highest ranking member of the U.S. military during the Second World War. He was outranked by both Marshall and Douglas MacArthur. And by outranked, what I mean is they all had the same rank, but the date of your rank established the order of seniority, and those two guys both outranked Ike.
It was a prime posting for a rising star like Eisenhower, a chance to see the baddest general of them all up close and personal. But god damn, it would be a bumpy ride. Like Eisenhower, MacArthur had a foul temper and an unwillingness to back down. During the 6 or so years they worked together, mostly in the Philippines, Eisenhower would find himself tearing what little remained of his hair out, trying to get MacArthur to listen. Still, the experience taught him a lot and sent him climbing ever further up the ranks.
So think about this, right? What's Eisenhower going to have to do in World War II? He's going to have to deal with big, stubborn personalities, right? He's going to have to deal with Churchill. He's going to have to deal with Montgomery. He's going to have to deal with Patton. He's going to have to deal with de Gaulle. And that was one of the things that we talked about, me and Susan Eisenhower, was his ability to handle delicate situations in such a way that left everybody in a better situation. That is not easy to do. And I'm guessing he learned a lot about how to deal with people like that from having to serve with MacArthur.
That meant that Ike was in the perfect place career-wise when war broke out again in Europe. Sent back to the USA in 1940, Eisenhower was promoted to Chief of Staff of the Third Army just in time for the legendary Louisiana maneuvers. By 1940, the American military was modernizing like crazy in case war came, and everyone needed some practice to figure out how to wield this high-powered new fighting machine. So General George C. Marshall basically had his men pick out an empty patch of Louisiana and said, well, that'll do, and sent nearly 500,000 troops down there to wargame the crap out of it.
Yeah, and this is probably a topic we need to cover more in depth, right? Because this is where some of the early leadership of the military, guys like Patton, guys like Eisenhower, are going to start to get on people's radar screens. And George C. Marshall, during the First World War, he was a mid-level staff officer, right? He's like a major, and I think later on a colonel. But he basically was given the job by Pershing of running the war for the Americans. He's on Pershing's staff, and he's the one who's creating the plans and kind of directing the show. And so, like Eisenhower, he gets recognized by those over him as someone who's got a career ahead.
Did Eisenhower shine during the maneuvers? Yeah, of course he did. Eisenhower's strategic planning in Louisiana was so impressive that he was promoted straight to brigadier general.
And this is one of the things that, another thing that I heard Susan Eisenhower talking about, wasn't in our interview, but it was something she talked about at another point when we were talking, is that when Dwight first goes to Gettysburg, when he's in his younger days, right? He was kind of bored by the tactics, the talk about this division went here and this brigade did this. He was a strategic thinker. He was asking questions like, okay, well, why did they end up in Gettysburg? What brought them here? What was going on in the war to that point? And it was obvious from his earliest days that Ike was a big picture guy. He's a strategic planner. When we're talking about strategy, we're talking about the war as a whole. And we're talking about logistics and maneuvers and entire army groups moving, whereas tactics is the small level part of things. So Ike was a big strategy guy.
Just in time, too, because that December, World War II finally caught up with America. The bombing of Pearl Harbor was the beginning of Eisenhower's stratospheric rise through the ranks. Sent to D.C. to work on war plans, he caught the eye of General Marshall, who promoted him right the way up to commander of U.S. troops in Europe. Partly this was due to Eisenhower's ability, but it was also due to him being the sort of person that people trusted.
Yeah, he gets sent over as a brigadier general to kind of observe and to kind of start making connections in Europe. And it's through that process. In fact, if you want to see a portrayal of this, I don't remember the name of it, but Robert Duvall played Ike in, I think it was a TV miniseries. And you see all of those kind of early parts of what Ike does when he first goes over there as this brigadier general amongst a bunch of generals and colonels and things like that. He's really nobody special, but he does such a great job of communicating what the needs are in Europe back to Marshall, that Marshall just continues to see greatness in him and continues to elevate him.
Remember that whole political slogan, I like Ike? Well, it worked because liking Ike was exactly what people did. Despite his discipline and strict religious background, Dwight Eisenhower was one of those guys you just can't help but want to be around. He was clever, funny, plain-spoken, but also sharply intelligent and persuasive. As the great British World War II officer Bernard Montgomery put it, he has the power of drawing the hearts of men toward him as a magnet attracts the bit of metal.
Which is huge at a time when you have guys like Monty and Patton and MacArthur who are great generals, but not necessarily very likable people at times. This is the kind of guy, Ike really was built for the Supreme Allied Commander role, right? Because it's a strategic role, so it requires a great strategic mind, but it's also a political role where you have to be able to deal with personalities in delicate situations and keep everybody happy. He was built for this.
He merely has to smile at you, and you trust him at once. In other words, Eisenhower was basically the military equivalent of the brainy, beautiful prom queen everyone wants to be around, only instead of a homecoming parade, he got to invade North Africa. Launched in November 1942, Operation Torch saw the Allies overrun Vichy France's colonies, triggering a revolution in Algeria and helping to bring the North Africa campaign crashing to a close. Although Eisenhower's planning wasn't perfect, mistakes were made, including the assumption that French colonial forces would welcome them as liberators. He did the job. With North Africa secured, Eisenhower was able to pivot to overseeing the invasion of Sicily, the campaign that led to Mussolini being removed from power.
So yeah, it's important to know, were mistakes made? Yeah, how much of that was Ike's fault? I'm not sure a lot of it was, but anytime you're doing something for the first time in a new role, there's going to be a learning curve. There are going to be adjustments. There's going to be things you're going to be like, okay, we learned from this. And Sicily is going to be another area where they're going to learn some things that they're going to be able to apply then to Normandy. But again, this is Ike doing Ike things. He's removing people who aren't performing well, and this is where he's going to put a guy like Patton in command of American troops, and this is where he's going to have to start dealing with multiple personalities.
As Italy collapsed into two warring states, one aligned with the Allies, the other with the Axis, it became clear that the wind was changing direction, that the much-promised invasion of France might now even be possible. Care to guess who'd be leading it? In later life, when he was president, Dwight Eisenhower was asked by his brother Milton to read the commencement address at Penn State. The morning of the big speech, big storms blew up, threatening the ceremony. Panicked, Milton asked his brother for advice if the weather turned. In response, Ike merely smiled and said, "Milton, I haven't worried about the weather since June the 6th, 1944. That's because June the 6th was the day Eisenhower had overseen the greatest seaborne invasion in history, D-Day." Promoted to Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force on Christmas Eve 1943, Eisenhower had spent the previous 6 months liaising in London with Winston Churchill and Charles de Gaulle to make sure that things went right. There were a lot of ways they could have gone wrong. Because of the tidal requirements and the need for a full moon, there were only a few days of any given month when the landings could be pulled off. That meant bad weather could throw not just Eisenhower's plans, but the fate of the whole of Europe into disarray.
And it had to be early enough, too, that you weren't going to get yourself in a situation where you were going to be bogged down by the winter. Your hope was to get across and make enough headway that by the time you get to winter, either the war is over or at least you've pushed your way significantly toward Germany. Do not underestimate the importance of and the weight of the decisions he had to make. You got guys like Trafford Lee Mallory, who's in charge of the Allied airborne operations, telling him, listen, if you do this, we're going to lose like 75% of these airborne guys. And him having to make that call anyway. And thankfully, it wasn't anywhere near that number. And if you want a great view into all of that part of Ike's decision-making, watch the story of Ike as played by Tom Selleck without a mustache. Does a great job of showing the tension involved in those. And even things like this guy, Group Captain Stagg, who is the guy in charge of the weather and how important the weather forecast was to all of this. Fascinating stuff.
Originally, Ike had scheduled D-Day for June the 5th, only to abort when bad weather was predicted. So it was with a feeling of incredible tenseness that Eisenhower listened to the forecast for June the 6th. This was it. The last day that month when conditions would be perfect. Even if they did the landings when the tides were right again in 2 weeks, there'd be no full moon. Quietly, Eisenhower heard the meteorologist's predictions for the morning. Probably fine with an outside chance of storms. And he said the 3 words that changed the course of the war. Okay, let's go. That morning of June the 6th, Eisenhower spoke to the assembled men. "You are about to embark upon the Great Crusade," the boy from North Texas told them, "toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you." Yep. With those words, D-Day began. The landings...
Now, here's the thing. He also wrote a speech taking full responsibility for its failure. Which is cool. I want to actually take a deeper look at both of those speeches real quick. Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving peoples everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. He will fight savagely. But this is the year 1944. Much has happened since the Nazi triumphs of 1940 and 41. The United Nations have inflicted upon the Germans great defeats in open battle, man to man. Our air offensive has seriously reduced their strength in the air and their capacity to wage war on the ground. Our home fronts have given us an overwhelming superiority in weapons and munitions of war and placed at our disposal great reserves of trained fighting men. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck. And let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking. That is a perfect tone for what these guys... Remember, a lot of these guys have never seen combat before this day. The airborne, the 101st, for example, first time in combat. Some of these guys had seen combat in Africa and Sicily and places like that, but most of them hadn't. Most of the pilots dropping the airborne guys behind enemy lines had never been under fire before. So this strikes the perfect tone of, listen, he's a tough enemy, but also we have all the reason in the world to be confident going up against him. It's really so well done. But I want to also take a look at what he had to say if it failed. So this is a note that he scribbled out. He put it in his pocket. And you see here, it says, our landings in the Cherbourg Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. That, my friends, is leadership. You give full credit to the men who fought, and you take full responsibility for the decision to send them into combat. It takes guts.
At Normandy are the stuff of legend and could easily occupy an entire 30-minute or more video of their own. Some 156,000 troops stormed the beaches, backed up by an invasion force numbering 1 million. On June the 6th alone, nearly 4,500 Allied soldiers were killed, with another 6,000 plus wounded or missing. In the coming weeks, thousands upon thousands more would die. But it was also the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. That December, with Paris liberated, Eisenhower was made a 5-star general. Just months later, Nazi Germany surrendered, ending the war in Europe, and Ike would return home a hero. Yet his reputation wasn't entirely spotless. In the last days of the European conflict, Eisenhower pulled his men back, allowing the Soviets to capture Berlin. This was what had been agreed at Yalta. Regardless, people back home accused the general of handing the communists a propaganda victory.
And that's unfortunate because it was not a decision that Ike was involved in. That was a decision made at the political level by civilian leadership, and he was just following orders.
But while the criticism may have stung, it didn't derail Ike's career in the slightest. That November, with the war in the Pacific also over, Harry Truman promoted Eisenhower to Chief of Staff. Ike had his disagreements with the president. He thought Truman had been a fool to authorize the use of atom bombs against Japan, arguing it made America look bad. But the two still got on well enough. So well that after Eisenhower stepped back from duty in early 1948, Truman suggested they should run on a joint ticket in that year's election. And it wasn't just Truman. Despite never having voted himself, Eisenhower was now being courted by factions in both parties to run for president.
It's kind of interesting to hear that he had never voted himself, because you know who else ran for president without ever having voted himself? Ulysses S. Grant. He had never lived in any one place long enough to establish residency with the rules at the time. And so, for example, in the 1860 election, he talks about in his autobiography, he said, I didn't vote in the election because I couldn't vote because I just moved to Illinois.
It was clear the public thought he was a shoo-in to win. And he would be, just not yet. Ike turned all election offers down, saying he needed to focus on serving his country. That November, Truman won a shock second term. In the aftermath, the president promoted Eisenhower to Supreme Commander of NATO forces. But 1948's brief brush with politics wouldn't be Ike's last. In just 4 short years, the general would return to Washington, and this time, it would be as Commander-in-Chief.
I believe, in the meantime, he serves as president of Columbia University.
Harry Truman's presidency officially ended on the 20th of January 1953, but really it had come crashing to an end over 2 years earlier in the summer of 1950. That's because that was the summer the Korean War broke out. The Korean War was as much a kick in the nuts to Truman's presidency as Vietnam was to Lyndon Johnson's or the Iraq War was to George W. Bush's. The nadir came when Truman relieved Douglas MacArthur of his commands, thus tanking his own popularity back home. Although Truman had now served 2 terms, the 22nd Amendment had made an exception for him as the sitting president when it came into force in 1951. Legally, he could have run again, but Korea put paid to that. With no possibility of winning his party's nomination, Harry Truman agreed to step aside. He hoped to create some space for a new generation of Democrat to take the White House. Instead, he threw the door wide open for an Eisenhower landslide.
And by the way, Truman, the last U.S. president to fight in ground combat as a soldier. We've had presidents since him that were in the Navy, for example, things like that. But the last one to serve in the Army and see combat on the ground was Harry Truman. He was an artillery captain during the First World War.
Through Truman's second term, Ike had been saying that he wouldn't run with all the sincerity of someone who is just desperate to be president. When a group of internationalist Republicans approached him, worried that their party might nominate an isolationist, the NATO commander sensed an opening. In January 1952, Eisenhower announced that he would seek the presidency as a Republican. Despite his massive popularity with the public, getting on the ticket was far from a sure thing. Primaries were different beasts in the mid-20th century, with many delegates chosen by the party. As a result, Eisenhower went into the 1952 convention unsure if the nomination would go to him or the isolationist and son of former president Robert A. Taft.
So, yeah, and he comes from the very famous Taft family. His grandson is going to be governor of Ohio a decade or so ago. Not particularly popular governor here in Ohio. It's a different time now when it comes to primaries, where basically the vast majority, especially on the Republican side, the vast majority of delegates are elected in primary elections. You have these super delegates on the Democrat side, but it wasn't always that way. You very often did not know who the nominee was going to be until after the convention was over.
It's at this point that a certain Californian senator enters our story. At the convention, Richard Nixon was Eisenhower's greatest asset, swinging enough delegates behind Ike to take him over the top. In fact, Ike was so certain that Dick Nixon had secured him the nomination that he made the senator his running mate.
Yep.
So, yeah, you could totally blame one of America's best 20th century presidents for paving the way for one of its absolute worst. The campaign that fall...
Not sure I agree with that, right? I think so much of Nixon is tarnished by Watergate and the corruption scandal there. But listen, I don't think Nixon is one of the worst presidents of the 20th century. Even close.
It was a watershed for US politics. 1952 is considered the first time TV played a significant role in an election, with the I Like Ike jingle becoming a national catchphrase.
We'll take Ike to Washington.
Although a pissed-off Harry Truman tried to sink Eisenhower's campaign by telling people, there was a time when I thought he would make a good president. That was my mistake. There was no doubt he was going to win, especially after Eisenhower made "I will go to Korea" one of his campaign pledges.
So, I think the main question with Eisenhower was, and his granddaughter talked about this with me, was not whether or not he could win the general election. I think as she put it, everyone knew that if he got the nomination, he'd get the election. The question was, would he get the nomination?
That November, Ike and Dick won an electoral college landslide, one which netted the GOP both chambers of Congress for only the second time since Herbert Hoover's presidency. On January the 20th, 1953, Dwight D. Eisenhower became the 34th president. One of his first acts was to follow through on his career promise. By now, the Korean War had been raging for nearly 3 years, with tens of thousands of American dead.
So I want to back up for a second and look at that video, because I think it's pretty grainy. You got Nixon right here, who is the vice president, but I'm pretty sure that might be Herbert Hoover right there, who was very much alive at this time. I could be wrong, though. I can't tell because it's really blurry.
Promise. By now, the Korean War had been raging for nearly 3 years, with tens of thousands of American deaths and millions of dead civilians. Outwardly, Eisenhower struck the posture of a peacemaker, but behind the scenes, he tried to drop hints that the US would consider a nuclear attack on North Korea's back at China if peace wasn't forged. Today, it's thought unlikely that the threat ended the war, with the change in leadership in the USSR likely playing a larger role. But when an armistice was signed in July of 1953...
That's a great point, because right around the time that Eisenhower becomes president, not too long, I think, before this, Stalin dies. And so you have a major shift in leadership, not only at the very top, but all around when it comes to the Soviet Union. So, and remember, the Korean War is really, even though there are troops on the ground for the United Nations and troops on the ground for the Chinese and the North Koreans, it's very much kind of a proxy war, right? It's backed by the communists on the north and backed by capitalism on the south.
It was atomic weapons that Eisenhower thought had given him the edge. For the rest of his tenure, Eisenhower's official policy would be nuclear attacks on any communist nation that threatened America's allies, a policy that became known as massive retaliation. As we'll soon see, though, the reality of the Cold War would be far more complex than Ike's policy allowed. State highway program.
Yep, huge infrastructure thing that really sets up the U.S. for the decades that follow. And there's some wisdom in what we just heard, right? Even though he may have been opposed to a lot of FDR's policies, he recognized, number one, their popularity, but also that there's something to be said for not making radical changes from the previous administration. Now we hear that all the time, right? When somebody runs for president, they paint their predecessor as an extremist or their opponent as an extremist and say, I'm going to completely scale back or remove all the stuff that person did, without recognizing that even though you might oppose what they had done, radically shifting back away from that isn't necessarily always the best idea for the country.
Which provided employment for swaths of people. At the same time, the president refused to lower taxes, saying it would be a waste of time. As a result, his bitterest opposition in Congress wasn't from Democrats, who retook the House and Senate in 1954, but the right wing of his own party.
And again, remember, this is a time when you still have liberals and conservatives in both parties. You know, it's not like it is today where there's a lot more polarization. The Republicans are increasingly conservative, Democrats increasingly liberal. You've got a mix of both, and that's why Ike, as kind of a moderate in there, again, is having to use his skills as someone who can bring people together to try and keep both wings of the party happy.
Still, Eisenhower's modern republicanism worked. Across his 2 terms, unemployment mostly stayed low, inflation hovered at 2%, and families found themselves able to buy things like second cars or newfangled TV sets. While around a fifth of Americans still lived in poverty, it was a number that fell across Ike's 8 years. In short, it was a great time to be alive, with one important caveat. To get the most out of the Eisenhower years, you had to be white. Although we remember the 1960s as the civil rights era, it was very much a live issue in Eisenhower's time. The military was desegregating, the Montgomery bus boycott was about to kick off, a charismatic preacher named Martin Luther King Jr. was making waves, and attitudes were changing. Among those changing were the attitudes of Eisenhower himself. Rather than pretend like everything was hunky-dory, Ike was aware that his America was an unequal one, and he was deeply conflicted about it. On the one hand, he seems to have felt that his administration could and should improve the lives of non-white Americans. On the other hand, he also had a huge sympathy for racist whites afraid of equality. You can see this internal conflict play out time and time again in the Eisenhower era. On the positive side, you have the Civil Rights Act of 1957. Championed by Eisenhower, it was the first piece of civil rights legislation passed since Reconstruction. Giving federal protection to voting rights, it should have been a game changer for Southern blacks who were often disenfranchised.
So it's important to note that Ike, like a lot of presidents, is trying to strike a balance. He's trying to ask himself the questions about what can I do. But to his credit, he was not above doing extreme things, right? Like calling out the 101st Airborne Division to protect black students who are going to a desegregated school. So, civil rights movement, that conversation really has to begin in the Eisenhower administration. Same with the space race.
By dumbass tests or taxes. But note the operative words in that sentence, should have. While Eisenhower had the best intentions, his legislation was just too toothless. For example, it gave disenfranchised voters the right to appeal before a jury, but in the Jim Crow South, where juries were all white, this just didn't make a damn difference. On the negative side, you also had the hot mess that was Brown and Board of Education. In 1954, the Supreme Court desegregated education in this landmark ruling. As he usually did, Eisenhower refrained from commenting, but this time, his lack of comment was taken as a tacit nod by racist Southerners. In 1957, the governor of Arkansas felt empowered to use the National Guard to block 9 black students from enrolling at Central High School in Little Rock. Eisenhower tried to talk him down and then sent federal troops to enforce desegregation. Yet he still never spoke up for the principles of integrated education, never had a moment like JFK's famous address arguing that desegregation wasn't just the law, but a moral imperative.
And that's a fair criticism, right? He didn't use the power of the bully pulpit, as Theodore Roosevelt would have called it, to use the gravitas of his office to speak up and to give a voice to people who didn't have a voice. And I think that's a very fair criticism to make.
In the end, it would be Lyndon Johnson who took the mantle of civil rights president. But that crown could have been Eisenhower's. Had he pushed just a little harder, he could have transformed the lives of millions of black Americans, and in doing so, transformed himself from merely a good president into a truly great one. As the 1956 election approached, it wasn't at all certain Eisenhower would run again. For years, he had been telling friends he'd be content to be a one-term wonder. Then in 1955, he was knocked flat by a massive heart attack. Many wondered if he'd ever recover. Yet recover, Ike did. He recovered, and he ran again for the presidency. It was
So at this point, he's about, 65 years old, running for a second term, which, by today's standard, not necessarily very old, but certainly older then. The life expectancy was much lower.
Even more lopsided win than in 1952. Eisenhower crushed it at the polls, sweeping even southern states that hadn't voted Republican since Reconstruction. Yet while Ike was always going to win, the margins were only so favourable because of what was happening in the rest of the world. Just a few days before the election, France, Britain and Israel had secretly teamed up to launch a surprise attack on Egypt. The Suez Crisis was the result of Egypt's leader nationalising the Suez Canal, but that's not important for this video. What is important is that none of the three attacking forces bothered to tell the US what they were going to do. And when Eisenhower found out, he was pissed. If Britain and France still had any illusions about who was the superpower, they lost them when Eisenhower did the geopolitical equivalent of spanking their asses, holding back their allowance, and grounding them for all eternity. While the crisis was a humiliation for the Europeans, it made Eisenhower look every bit the badass general like he'd been back in World War II. But while the Suez Crisis saw Ike act decisively, his foreign policy wouldn't always be so resolute. In fact, it would be more often characterized by surprising hesitancy. The same year as the Suez Crisis, an anti-communist revolution blew up in Hungary, one swiftly followed by a Soviet invasion. Given his policy of massive retaliation, some expected Eisenhower to respond to Soviet aggression. But despite, or perhaps because of his years as war hero, Eisenhower just didn't want to get involved. He didn't want to risk another war.
So remember, at this point, you've got Soviet influence over Eastern Europe, and you've got the Western influence over Western Europe, and you've got Germany divided into two separate countries, East Germany, West Germany, and that's based on the Soviet zone of influence became East Germany, and the French, British, and American zones of influence become West Germany. And so you've got this ideological divide happening in Europe, and Churchill very famously calls it an iron curtain that would descend on Eastern Europe. And so the Soviets are seeing how far can we push this, right? They're in some ways doing kind of what Hitler did in the 1930s. Okay, I'm going to Anschluss, Austria. Okay, I'm going to take the Sudetenland, and we're going to see how far I can keep pushing this. And now they're going to take Hungary, and they're going to influence elections in all these countries, and they're going to dominate Poland and Yugoslavia. The U.S. basically lets it happen.
Something similar played out in the war in Indochina. In 1954, the French requested American assistance to subdue their former colonies. As he would with Hungary, though, Eisenhower demurred. The French were defeated, and Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos became independent nations. Unlike the General Eisenhower who'd stormed the beaches of Normandy, President Eisenhower seemed to avoid a fight at any cost. At least, he did openly. Behind the scenes, he authorized the CIA to do some seriously dirty stuff. It was under Eisenhower that the CIA of infamy, the coup-plotting, government-toppling CIA, came into its own. With Eisenhower's knowledge, the agency deposed elected leaders in Iran and Guatemala, helping set up two dictators and trigger a civil war. While the other presidents would authorize more destructive actions, it was Eisenhower who first really let the CIA loose. Yet, what did his voters care? The odd Suez Crisis aside, foreign affairs just didn't figure that much into Americans' minds. Especially when...
Which is interesting at a time when the Cold War is beginning. It's difficult not to think about foreign policy, but I think people were just exhausted, right? They're exhausted from World War II, and then a couple years later, the Korean War, and now the Soviets have nuclear weapons, and you just don't want to have to think about all that stuff all the time.
When things were not going so well at home. But Eisenhower's presidency finally ended in January 1961. By then, he'd overseen the last expansion of the Union when Hawaii and Alaska both became states in 1959. Although he was broadly popular when he stepped down, there were still signs that the era of I Like Ike was coming to an end.
And that speech is well worth your time to listen to, where he rails against the military-industrial complex and really offers some very wise warnings, much in the same way that guys like Washington did in his farewell address. Now, I'm a little disappointed that they didn't really spend any time talking about NASA, right? Because the National Aeronautics and Space Administration is going to start under Eisenhower. It's going to be Eisenhower's administration that's going to decide, okay, what kind of people do we want to be astronauts, and how are we going to go about setting up a space program? That was, to me, a huge part of Eisenhower's administration.
The previous November, voters had plumped not for the continuity candidate Richard Nixon, but a young senator from Massachusetts who promised a new direction. But while Ike would live to see the whole of the JFK-LBJ era, he wouldn't be around much longer. In 1965, Eisenhower suffered another heart attack that left him badly weakened. 3 years later, he had sickened enough to be permanently checked into Walter Reed Army Hospital. He'd never leave. On March the 28th, 1969, Dwight Eisenhower died, aged 78. He'd lived just long enough to see his grandson marry the daughter of his old VP, Julie Nixon, setting up a new political dynasty.
Yeah, so his grandson David, to his son John's son, John looked just like Ike, and John is the father of Susan Eisenhower, who I interviewed. And she looks just like her grandpa, too. Like, you can see that strong family resemblance.
Now he was content to spend his final moments holding his beloved Mammy's hand. His last words were, "I want to go. God take me." The America Ike left behind was already very different from the one he'd ruled. Civil rights had drastically expanded. The country was embroiled in a devastating war in Vietnam, and new social movements had exploded that would have been unthinkable just a decade earlier. And yet it would be this new America that came to recognize Ike as one of its best modern leaders. Today, with the benefit of hindsight, we can see that Eisenhower wasn't quite a great president, even if he was a very good one. He could...
I don't know if I agree with that, though. I feel like he was a great president. I think if you're in the conversation for top 10 of all time, and I think pretty much everybody agrees he's a top 10 all-time president, I think that makes you great.
And should have pushed harder on civil rights, and his willingness to interfere in countries like Iran and Guatemala left some hot messes behind that his successors would have to clear up.
True.
Still, when you get down to it, there's no doubting that Eisenhower was a fundamentally decent man who enjoyed a remarkable career. I mean, even if he'd never become president, we'd probably still feature him in a video as the guy who led goddamn D-Day. That he managed to not just go on to become president, but also be one of the top 10 presidents of all time, speaks volumes about his abilities as a leader. And perhaps that's how he'd want to be remembered, not just as a president, but as a leader, a man who led his country through one of the defining decades of its existence. Whether you think he was a truly great president or merely a good one, there's no doubting that without him, both the US and the world in general would be a very different place.
Thank you, and good night.
So his farewell speech is fantastic. There's some really cool video available of him going back to France, England and France, on the 20th anniversary of D-Day in 1964, right before his health got bad. It's really cool to kind of follow him as they talk about all that stuff, and you can find all that stuff on YouTube. But here at the end, I will throw up a link to my interview with his granddaughter, Susan, which is really, really cool. She's a wonderful lady, super smart, very gracious with her time and kind. And if you haven't checked it out already, check it out. Thanks for watching.